Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to realize they were slowly destroying your life? My wife was my world until she sold me like an object. What started as jokes and manipulative words spiraled into something I never imagined. This is the darkest chapter of my life. How I was sold to a stranger to pay off my wife's debts and, against all odds, found freedom. But what happened to her in the end? Stick around because the ending will leave you speechless. I met Lauren on a chilly autumn afternoon in New York City. She was radiant, her laughter infectious, and her confidence magnetic. From the moment we locked eyes at a crowded cafe, I was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. At first, everything about her seemed flawless. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only man in the world, as if she saw something in me that no one else ever had. As our relationship progressed, her charm only deepened. She could light up any room she walked into, and I felt lucky to be by her side. She made me believe we were unstoppable, a perfect team. My friends envied me, and even my mother told me, "She's the best thing to ever happen to you." I believed it too. But looking back, I can see the cracks that had always been there, cracks I refused to notice. Her confidence often bordered on arrogance, and her need for control peeked through in subtle ways. A sly comment here, a dismissive laugh there. At the time, I thought it was just her quirky personality. I was blind, too infatuated to see the truth. It began with small things. "Michael, that shirt doesn't suit you," she'd say casually, tossing it into a donation pile without asking me. At first, I didn't mind. After all, I trusted her taste. But then it escalated. She started telling me who I could and couldn't see. "That friend of yours, Todd? He's a bad influence. You don't need people like him in your life." I laughed it off, thinking she was just being protective. But soon, it became clear. It wasn't protection, it was control. Every decision I made, from the food I ate to the hobbies I enjoyed, had to pass her approval. If I pushed back, she'd pout or worse, explode into a tirade about how I didn't value her opinion. Her words cut deep. "Do you even know how to take care of yourself? You'd be lost without me." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, calculated, with a sweetness that made me feel guilty for even questioning her. As time went on, her words grew sharper. "Michael, do you even understand how much I sacrifice for us?" she'd say, her voice laced with indignation. It became her mantra. She was the martyr, the one holding our lives together, while I was the burden she carried. At first, I tried to reason with her. I worked hard, contributed equally to our finances, and did everything I could to support her dreams. But in Lauren's world, it was never enough. She would twist every conversation to remind me how much she was doing for me, how little I contributed in comparison. One night, after a particularly harsh argument, she stormed into the living room where I had retreated to gather my thoughts. "You're lucky to have me," she hissed, her eyes cold. "Do you think anyone else would put up with someone like you?" Her words left me speechless. I started doubting myself, wondering if I truly was as incapable as she made me feel. Lauren had a way of making her insults sound like truths, and I swallowed them whole, believing every syllable. The worst part was how she wielded my love for her like a weapon. "I do everything for you, Michael," she'd say with a bittersweet smile. "And how do you repay me?" "By failing." Those words became my constant torment. Lauren had a dark sense of humor, one that often left me feeling uneasy. "One day, I'll sell you to someone rich," she joked at dinner one night, laughing as if it was the funniest thing in the world. I forced a smile, pretending to find it funny too, but inside, it felt wrong. Her jokes about selling me became more frequent. She'd say it with a playful tone, but there was always an edge to her words, something that made the air around her feel heavy. "Maybe someone else will appreciate you more than I do," she said one night, smirking as she sipped her wine. At first, I dismissed it. Surely, it was just her twisted humor, a way to get a reaction out of me. But over time, the jokes started to feel like warnings, like she was testing the waters for something much darker. The night that broke me was when she looked me in the eyes and said, "You know, Michael, you're worth more as someone else's property than as my husband." She laughed, But I couldn't. Something in her tone told me she wasn't joking anymore. Lauren's control over my life tightened like a noose. Slowly but surely, she severed every connection I had to the outside world. It started with subtle comments about my friends and family. "Why does your sister always call you so late? She's so needy," she'd say, rolling her eyes. Or, "Your friends just drag you down, Michael. They don't want what's best for you like I do." At first, I didn't realize what was happening. She framed it as care, convincing me she was protecting me from toxic influences. But before I knew it, I had stopped answering calls, avoiding visits, and declining invitations. When my best friend Todd invited me to his engagement party, Lauren threw a fit. "Do you really think it's fair to leave me alone while you go drink and have fun with people who don't even like me?" she demanded. I gave in like I always did. It was easier than fighting. But the loneliness crept in, suffocating me. My world became smaller and smaller, revolving entirely around her moods, her wants, her rules. One day I mentioned missing my mom. It had been months since I'd seen her. Lauren's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, you miss your mom? Why don't you go live with her, then? I'm sure she'd love to babysit you." Her words were laced with venom, and I knew better than to push further. The isolation was complete. I had no one to turn to, no one to share my fears with. She was my entire world now. Not because I wanted her to be, but because she had made it that way. Every day with Lauren felt like walking on eggshells. I never knew what would set her off. A forgotten chore, a misplaced word, or even a look she didn't like could ignite her fury. She had a way of turning the smallest issues into full-blown catastrophes, leaving me scrambling to apologize for things I didn't even understand. Her anger was unpredictable, like a storm that came out of nowhere. One evening, I accidentally spilled coffee on her favorite magazine. It was an innocent mistake, but she exploded. "You can't do anything right, can you?" she screamed, throwing the ruined pages at me. "I work so hard to keep this house together, and you can't even respect that." I tried to reason with her, but it was like talking to a wall. She was relentless, tearing me down with words that cut deeper than any physical wound. "You're useless," she spat, her voice cold. "A waste of space. If it weren't for me, you'd have nothing." Her words replayed in my mind long after she left the room. I began to believe them, internalizing her cruelty as truth. I was afraid to make decisions, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly in her presence. The fear consumed me, making every day feel like a battle for survival. But the worst part wasn't her anger. It was the moments of calm that followed. She'd act as if nothing had happened, smiling and chatting like the loving wife I once thought she was. It was maddening, leaving me questioning whether I was the one who had overreacted. The tension in our home was unbearable, but I held on, convincing myself that things would get better. They had to. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Lauren wasn't just angry or controlling. She was cruel. And worse, she seemed to enjoy watching me unravel. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I overheard her on the phone in the other room. Her laughter echoed down the hall, sharp and unfamiliar. "He's pathetic," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Honestly, I don't even know why I stay with him. Maybe I should sell him after all." My blood ran cold. I wanted to believe she was joking, but there was no humor in her tone. I stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, unable to breathe. For the first time, the weight of her words fully hit me. She didn't love me. She didn't even care about me. I was just a tool for her, something to manipulate and discard when I was no longer useful. The next morning, I confronted her. "Lauren, what are you planning?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked up from her coffee with a sly smile. "Oh, Michael, don't be so dramatic," she said, brushing me off. But there was something in her eyes, something cold and calculating, that made my stomach churn. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. But leaving wasn't an option. She had isolated me so completely that I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home, with no way out. Lauren's mood darkened over the next few weeks, her sharp comments growing harsher and more frequent. She seemed preoccupied, her phone constantly buzzing with calls she refused to take in front of me. One night, after she stormed out of the house in a rage, I found a stack of unopened letters on her desk. Curiosity and desperation got the better of me. I opened the first envelope, and what I saw made my heart sink. It was a notice of overdue credit card payments, tens of thousands of dollars in debt. The next letter was worse, a formal warning from a collection agency threatening legal action. I stared at the pile, my hands shaking. She had always lived extravagantly, but I never imagined it was this bad. Designer clothes, luxury dinners, expensive vacations. All of it had been a facade, funded by money we didn't have. When she returned home, I confronted her. "Lauren, what is this?" I demanded, holding up the letters. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "How dare you go through my things?" she screamed, snatching the papers from my hands. "You've been lying to me," I shouted back, for the first time standing my ground. But instead of apologizing, she laughed. "You don't get it, do you? I've been carrying this relationship on my back for years. If I'm in debt, it's because of you." Her words stunned me into silence. She had twisted everything, turning her mistakes into my fault, just like she always did. But this time, there was something different in her tone. She wasn't just angry. She was desperate. The tension in the house had reached a fever pitch. Lauren's desperation became palpable, seeping into every corner of our lives. She avoided me whenever she could, spending long hours locked in her office on hushed phone calls. At night, I'd hear her pacing the floor, her footsteps frantic. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. She was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV with a glass of wine in her hand. Her once pristine posture was slumped, her hair disheveled. She looked nothing like the woman I had fallen in love with. "Lauren," I began, keeping my voice steady. "We need to talk. About the debt. About everything." She didn't even look at me. "It's under control," she muttered, taking another sip of wine. "No, it's not," I said firmly. "I've seen the letters. I know you're drowning. Why won't you let me help?" At that, she laughed. A bitter, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "Help?" she said, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were glassy, her smile cruel. "You think you can help me, Michael? You're just as useless as ever." Her words stung, but I refused to back down. "If you don't let me help, you're going to lose everything," I said. For a moment, she was silent, her expression unreadable. Then, she leaned forward, her voice low and venomous. "You want to help, Michael? Fine. I've already figured out a way for you to do that." Her words hung in the air like a threat. I felt my stomach twist as she reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper. She slid it across the table toward me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking as I picked it up. "It's an agreement," she said casually, as if she were discussing the weather. "You're going to work for someone. A woman I know. She's wealthy, generous even. She's willing to pay enough to cover my debts." I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't be serious," I said. "Oh, I'm dead serious," she replied, her tone icy. "Do you have any better ideas? Because this is the only way we're getting out of this mess." "You mean the mess you created?" I shot back. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might hit me. But instead, she smiled. A cold, calculated smile that made my skin crawl. "I'm doing what needs to be done," she said. "And so are you. Unless you'd rather see us homeless." I wanted to refuse, to stand up and walk out the door. But the look in her eyes stopped me. There was no reasoning with her, no escaping the trap she had laid. She had already made up her mind. And so, against every instinct I had, I signed the paper. The morning came faster than I expected. I woke up to the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Black, sleek, and unmarked. Lauren was already up, dressed impeccably in one of her designer outfits, her makeup flawless. It was as if she were hosting a guest, not sending her husband away to be someone else's property. "Get up," she said curtly, not even looking at me. "They're here." I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lauren," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to do this. We can find another way. Please." She turned to me with a look of utter disgust. "Another way? Are you serious, Michael? This is the only way. I'm not about to let your uselessness drag me down any further." Her words hit like a slap, but I was too numb to respond. I dressed mechanically, my hands shaking as I buttoned my shirt. By the time I made it downstairs, a man was standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His presence filled the room, and his expression was unreadable. "This him?" the man asked, glancing at me like I was a piece of furniture. "Yes," Lauren replied, her voice sharp and businesslike. "He's ready." I wasn't. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "Where am I going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To someone who knows how to use you," Lauren snapped. "Unlike me." The man gestured for me to follow him, and Lauren shoved a small suitcase into my hands. "Go," she said, her voice cold and final. As I stepped outside, the sunlight felt harsh, almost blinding. The man opened the car door, and I hesitated, looking back at Lauren one last time. She didn't meet my eyes. The drive was silent. I wanted to ask the man where we were going, but his expression made it clear he wasn't interested in conversation. Instead, I stared out the window, the city streets blurring into countryside as we left everything I knew behind. Finally, after what felt like hours, the car pulled up to a sprawling estate. The house was massive, with towering pillars and manicured gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. It looked like something out of a movie, a place where people like me didn't belong. The man led me to the front door and knocked twice. A woman answered, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. She was striking, tall, elegant, and composed, with a presence that demanded attention. Her piercing blue eyes scanned me, and I felt exposed, like she could see every broken piece of me. "This is him?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied. She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Come inside," she said, stepping aside to let me in. As I crossed the threshold, I couldn't help but feel like I had entered another world, one where I was nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. And yet, as terrifying as it was, there was a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I was free of Lauren. But at what cost? The woman introduced herself as Mira. She had an air of quiet authority, the kind that made you feel small without uttering a word. I was led through the house, its grandeur overwhelming. Everything was pristine, from the marble floors to the glittering chandeliers. It was a world completely foreign to me, and I felt out of place, like a stain on the pristine surface of her life. Mira didn't speak much as she showed me around. She seemed to be sizing me up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was aware of my every thought, every hesitation. I didn't know whether to be terrified or intrigued. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of walking through the cold, empty halls, she stopped in front of a large office door and gestured for me to enter. "This will be your space," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Inside was a sleek, minimalist office. There was a desk, a few chairs, and a large window overlooking the estate's gardens. But despite the luxury surrounding me, I felt a deep sense of unease. "I expect you to be useful," Mira said as she stood by the door. Her words were simple, but there was an unspoken weight to them. "You will assist me in whatever I need, Michael, and I trust you will understand that there will be consequences for any disobedience." Her eyes bore into mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fear, not of physical punishment, but something more insidious. A fear of being trapped again, of becoming a tool in someone else's hands, just like I had been with Lauren. "I understand," I said quietly, though inside, I was screaming. I wanted to escape. I wanted to go back home, but I had no idea where that was anymore. Mira left me alone in the office, and I sat down in the chair behind the desk. The weight of the situation finally sank in. I wasn't just here to work. I had been sold. My life, my freedom, my future, all handed over to a stranger. But as I sat in that sterile room, something inside me hardened. Lauren had stripped me of my dignity, my independence, but this felt different. Myra's presence was commanding, but it wasn't malicious. It was almost clinical. I wasn't just her servant. I was a part of some larger plan, and I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The days blurred together as I adapted to my new life. Mira kept me busy, but in a way that made it feel like I was nothing more than a shadow in her grand design. I ran errands, filed papers, answered calls. But despite the monotony of my tasks, there was something strangely peaceful about this existence. Mira didn't yell at me. She didn't belittle me. In fact, she rarely even acknowledged my presence, unless she had something specific for me to do. There was no abuse here, no constant threat of humiliation. But there was a cold distance that kept me at arm's length. One afternoon, she called me into her office. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. I obeyed without question. "I have a proposition for you," Mira began, her voice as smooth as silk. "You may wonder why I agreed to take you in." I nodded silently, unsure of what to say. "You see, I wasn't always in control of my life, Michael," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "I was once in your position, vulnerable, powerless, and trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse. I know what it's like to feel small, to be at the mercy of someone who only wants to destroy you." My heart skipped a beat. Was she telling me her story? "I had a husband," she said quietly, as if the words tasted bitter. "He was cruel, manipulative, just like your wife. He used me, broke me down piece by piece until I was nothing more than a shell of the person I used to be." Mira paused, her eyes distant, lost in memories I could never understand. "But I escaped. I found a way out. And now I help others do the same. I bring people like you here, people who are too broken to fight for themselves. I give them a chance to rebuild." I stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. She was offering me redemption, a second chance at life. "You're not here to work for me out of kindness, Michael," she continued, her gaze piercing. "You're here because I see something in you. I see the potential for you to rise above what you've been through. You've already survived one form of hell. Now it's time for you to heal." Her words hit me harder than I could have imagined. For the first time in so long, I felt something resembling hope. The shackles that had bound me to Lauren's cruelty were gone. But could I truly find peace here? Was I just trading one cage for another? The days that followed Myra's revelation were a blur. I found myself slowly adjusting to the rhythm of life in the estate. I was still uncertain, still haunted by the weight of my past, and the feeling that I had been abandoned by everyone I had ever loved. But Myra's offer lingered in my mind, like a distant promise that was almost too good to be true. She had given me a glimpse of what freedom might look like, but I wasn't sure I could trust it. It was one evening when Mira called me to her office again. This time, she didn't ask me to sit across from her. She motioned for me to sit beside her, on the same side of the desk. Her gesture was unexpected, and it felt almost intimate. "Michael," she began, her voice calm but serious, "you've been here for a while now, and I think it's time for you to make a choice." I swallowed hard, trying to control my nerves. My mind raced, but I couldn't find the words. She continued, her eyes fixed on me. "I told you I help people like you, but I don't do it out of charity. I do it because I see something in you, something that can't be left to waste. You've been broken, Michael, but I believe you can rebuild yourself. The question is, do you want to?" I blinked, not sure I understood. "Rebuild myself?" I echoed, my voice weak. "Yes," she said, nodding. "You've been broken down by someone who never cared for you. You were manipulated, controlled, used. But that's not who you are. I'm offering you a chance to learn who you really are. To be more than the man your wife shaped you to be." I sat there in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. Could I really rebuild myself? Was I capable of something better than what Lauren had reduced me to? The question hung in the air like a thick fog. You've been living in the shadow of your past for too long, Mira continued, her voice softening. But you don't have to let it define you. I can help you find yourself again. I can teach you the skills, the mindset, everything you need to build a new life. But you have to decide, do you want to stay stuck in the past? Or do you want to move forward? The choice was before me, but it felt impossible. On one hand, I could stay in this sterile, lifeless place, safe but emotionally hollow. On the other, I could try to rebuild myself, try to reclaim the person I had been before Lauren had torn me apart. But was I strong enough for that? I looked at Mira, the woman who had given me a chance at redemption, and I finally understood. This wasn't just about escaping from Lauren. This was about discovering who I was outside of her shadow. I want to rebuild, I said quietly, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. Mira nodded, her expression unreadable. Good, she said simply. Then we begin tomorrow. The next few weeks were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Mira kept her word. She didn't just throw me into the deep end and expect me to swim. She was methodical, patient, and surprisingly kind in her own way. She taught me how to manage my emotions, how to take control of my thoughts, and most importantly, how to start seeing myself as something worth saving. I spent countless hours with Mira, learning the ins and outs of her business. At first, I felt like a child, stumbling through the simplest tasks. But slowly, I started to gain confidence. Mira never asked for perfection, only progress. And that was the first time in my life I felt like I wasn't being judged for my past mistakes. It wasn't easy. Every day, I had to fight the urge to revert to the person Lauren had shaped me into. The person who was afraid, small, and constantly second-guessing himself. But each small victory, each task I completed with more competence, each conversation I had without trembling, pushed me further away from the man I had been. One day, after a particularly grueling week of work, Mira sat me down in her office. She looked at me, her eyes sharp, but there was something different now, an almost imperceptible softness. You've come a long way, Michael, she said, her voice laced with approval. I didn't expect you to change this quickly. I smiled faintly, though I wasn't sure I even knew who I was anymore. I still feel lost, I admitted, my voice cracking, like I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be now. That's okay, Mira said gently. The person you were is gone, but the person you will be, that's up to you. I took a deep breath, trying to digest her words. I wasn't sure if I would ever feel fully healed, or if I would ever be able to forget the pain of my past. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a future. One where I could choose my path, my identity, and my worth. Months had passed since I made the decision to rebuild myself, and each day felt like a victory. At first, it was hard to believe that I could escape the trauma that Lauren had inflicted on me. But Myra's patience and consistent support slowly worked their way under my skin. Every lesson, every task, every quiet conversation she had with me made me feel like I was regaining a part of myself that I thought was lost forever. I woke up one morning, just like any other day, but something was different. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the room. It wasn't the kind of light that made me feel trapped or overwhelmed, as it had so many times before. Today, it felt like freedom, like I could finally breathe in a way I hadn't been able to in years. I stood up, stretched, and took a deep breath. There was no weight on my chest, no tightness in my throat. For the first time in so long, I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. I wasn't bracing for a harsh comment or a sudden outburst. The emotional fog I had lived in for so long was starting to lift, and with it, the tight grip of fear and shame that had haunted me. As I walked through the halls of Myra's estate, I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer the broken man who had been dropped off here like a commodity. I had found purpose. I had a reason to get up in the morning. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was the one in control now. Mira had taught me that my worth wasn't tied to how others saw me, especially not someone like Lauren, who had stripped me of everything good I had. She had helped me understand that I had always been more than the version of myself that had been manipulated and beaten down. I had to believe that I was worthy of more. I walked into the kitchen and Mira was there, as she always was in the mornings, preparing her tea. She didn't greet me with the same authoritative tone she had in the beginning. She had become a guide, not a warden. She didn't need to control me anymore because I had taken control of myself. "You're quiet today," she said, glancing up from her tea. "I'm just thinking," I replied, "about everything." Mira nodded as if she understood. "It's been a long journey for you, Michael. It's normal to feel reflective." I took a seat across from her, the weight of my past still there, but it didn't suffocate me like it once had. It was no longer my identity. "I've come a long way," I said quietly. "I never thought I would get here." "I know," Mira said with a soft smile. "But you did. You're not the man who walked into this house months ago. You're something more now." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Mira was a woman who had endured her own suffering, and somehow, she had found a way to make something of herself, to help others in ways I hadn't imagined possible. She was no longer just the person who had rescued me from Lauren. She was someone who had shown me what it meant to reclaim your life. "I don't know what's next," I said, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. "That's okay," Mira said, reaching for my hand. "You don't have to know everything right now. You've already made the most important decision. You've chosen to live for yourself." The weight of her words hit me like a wave. I didn't have to have it all figured out. The future didn't have to be perfect. What mattered was that I had taken the first step to becoming the person I was meant to be. I didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. I was free. As I left the estate that afternoon, walking down the long driveway and into the open air, it felt like the first time I was truly walking on my own. There were no chains holding me back, no past looming over me, no toxic relationships dragging me under. It was just me, and the possibility of everything I could become. I didn't look back. Couldn't. If you've been with me through this journey, I hope my story has given you something to reflect on, something to hold on to, no matter where you are in your own life. We've all been through our own struggles, and we all have moments when we feel like we can't take another step. But I want you to remember this. Your past does not define you. The person you were yesterday does not have to be the person you are today. There's always a way forward. It might not be easy, but you can rebuild. You can heal. It takes time, patience, and strength. But if you choose to take that first step like I did, you'll start to see the world in a different light. You'll start to see yourself in a different light. If you're in a dark place right now, if you're struggling to find your way, just know that you are not alone. You have the power to change. I know it's hard to believe that sometimes, but trust me, it's possible. If you found something in my story that resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. What's your story? How are you rebuilding? And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We're in this together. Remember, no matter what you've been through, you have the power to create a new future. The only thing stopping you is the belief that you can't. And if you believe in yourself, you'll find your way. Stay strong. Keep moving forward. And I'll see you in the next video.